Alright, how's it going, y'all? So in this video, we're going to be talking about what hard drive should you buy for your Synology NAS. This is going to be specifically for Synology, though it does more or less apply to the rest of the NAS operating systems, QNAP, whatever you want to go with, ASUS Store. But we are also going to be talking about specifically the Synology hard drives and what effect that has on everything. So pretty much everything should be true for other NAS brands, except for when we get to the Synology hard drives, because I would not recommend buying a Synology hard drive over any other hard drive if you're not going to be putting in a Synology. All right, so some disclaimers here. I want to start by talking about before I ever started doing SpaceRex. So before I started SpaceRex and before I ever got into Synology, when I was looking for my very first Synology, the hard drive that I chose was a Seagate Iron Wolf drive. That was my unbiased opinion then, and tends to be my unbiased recommendation now. I have had a couple of companies actually send me hard drives for free, but that was my opinion before I ever started SpaceRex, and as I've worked with them more, I've never really had too many issues with Seagate Iron Wolf drives, and it tends to be what I recommend. But before I started any of this, the first hard drives I bought were Seagate Iron Wolf drives, and that was from my research at the time. All right, so before we get started, let's go ahead and just talk about really the three different categories of drive that you can go for when you are looking at buying a NAS, specifically a Synology NAS. All right, and so the three categories you've kind of got here are Shucking drives, and so that's where you take a external hard drive enclosure like this, which tend to be very cheap, and you pull out the hard drive. Generally, you want to try to guesstimate what hard drive is going to be in there based off of forum posts and things like that, and you can actually get a lot of storage for really cheap. Then over here we've got the next tier, and that's going to be either your WD Reds or Red Pros and your Seagate Iron Wolves or Iron Wolf Pros. Those are the main guys who are going to be making NAS drives. And I'd also throw in there actually the Seagate Exos, but we're going to be talking about that later. Those are basically the design for mass storage drives that tend to be really designed to be in arrays of massive amounts of disks. And then finally, category 3, it's in a lot of ways very similar to category 2, and that's actually buying the Synology branded hard drives. So quick fact, Synology does not actually manufacture these. I'd be worried if they did. Basically, Synology has a partnership with Toshiba, and Toshiba, who already makes enterprise drives, basically makes the Synology hard drive, and Synology gets to have its own custom firmware and just ensure that everything plays nicely. It's not quite complete vertical integration because it's not like they're designing their own hard drives, but with the amount of units they're selling, they'd probably be pretty poor hard drives or be incredibly expensive. And note, sometimes that is your only option. But we'll go ahead and talk about that in a minute here. All right, so first I want to start with the shucked drives. So shucking hard drive is actually pretty simple. Basically, you just take a case like this. This is a WD Easy Store, a Western Digital Easy Store. And you go ahead and say, oh, I got a great deal on this. Sometimes these can literally be half as expensive as NAS branded hard drives with a NAS hard drive in there. And so what you do is you basically just rip open the case and pull out the hard drive, which is what I've done here. And so you can see they're almost all, I don't think any of them, especially in this larger form factor, are going to be the same hard drive layout. You can just stick them right in a Synology, and that allows you to save a ton of money on space. So as I said earlier, sometimes you can literally find in this a Western Digital Red drive, or Seagate's option. I've seen Exos and Iron Wolf Pros in there. Why are they giving these away for so much cheaper? So a lot of people will say that it's because they have to reduce stock in certain areas, but in reality, they're likely doing a process called binning. So binning is a process of taking drives or any objects that don't quite meet spec and putting them in a lower spec option. And so the advantage of these cases and why they are still sold cheaper than the other hard drives, even though they have just as amount of storage and sometimes the exact same hard drives in there, is because when you purchase this, you are not a business probably. You are not somebody who is really relying on this. And if the drive fails, even if it's in this enclosure, which is who this is designed for, it's not like the company is going to get that much bad PR because, hey, it's a cheap external hard drive enclosure. Not that big of a deal. Maybe I knocked it, maybe this. And so it's really a nice way for them to get rid of hard drives that are maybe a little bit more questionable while still making money back. So these are not going to be hard drives that actually go through and are physically tested and then fail. No, that would be way too expensive. If a hard drive fails, they're just going to throw it out. And so the way these manufacturing plants work is they don't do in-depth testing on every single drive. That would take way too long and be way too expensive. Instead, what they do is they do in-depth testing on a certain number from every single batch. Maybe it's the shift, maybe it is a certain serial number range, but they do that very specific testing per batch. And this should give them an overall view as to how the entire batch is performing and allows quality control without being incredibly expensive and time intensive. And so likely what these companies are doing is they go and say, okay, well, this batch may have had a few issues. They found more duds in this batch than they usually would and is outside of their standard deviation that they allow for a specific batch. And so the majority of these drives are likely totally fine. But maybe they're not. Maybe they're going to have an issue in a few years. Maybe something weird happened with manufacturing. And so instead of throwing out the entire batch, what they'll do is they'll test them and they'll just throw them in a case like this. This way, if the drive fails, it is not besmirching the name of Iron Wolf Pro. It is not doing that. Instead, it's just saying, oh, it's an easy store. It failed. Who cares? It's not that big of a deal. And so you do tend to get more lemons in these drives. But at the same time, a shuck drive can last just as long as a regular store-bought hard drive. And in some ways, especially if you're buying from Amazon, that's a pretty protective case compared to just a paper bag. I've seen some of these shipped in before. So it's not the worst idea, especially if you're on a budget. Though for businesses, I would not recommend them. You don't get the same warranty a lot of times, though sometimes you do. And it's just going to be a little bit more likely to fail. And I would not trust it for full-on business who really needs to make sure uptime is. I mean, saving $500 on hard drive costs, it's not that big of a deal to a business sometimes, when if those drives have issues, it can easily cost employees 10 times that over time if there are issues. And so that's shucking drives. The one recommendation I do have is before you ever pull off the case, because as soon as you pull off the case, you're gonna have a lot of trouble actually returning the thing. Make sure to do an in-depth test on it to make sure it doesn't fail. And so that's shucked drives, and as you can see, I've done it before. It's an easy way to get cheap storage. And so now onto the specific NAS drives. So specific NAS drives have a very key feature in them that regular hard drives do not have. And so if you're going to be having more than 2 bays, I would really make sure whatever NAS drive you do get has what's called vibration sensors in there. So if you have all the same hard drives, all rotating at the exact same rate, you can start developing what's called harmonics. And so this is where they basically amplify each other and start causing more and more vibration because they're all spinning at the exact same RPM. This can actually damage hard drives over time, and the more hard drives you have in a rack or in a NAS, the more this is likely to happen. And so NAS drives all have this vibration sensor. This vibration sensor detects the harmonics and will actually slow the NAS drives down or speed them up to get them out of that harmonic, keeping the NAS drive from vibrating itself apart. And so that can really expand the lifespan of them. 2 is probably not necessary, but anything more than that, make sure you are getting the NAS drives because it's just worth it more for you. Then you've got pretty much all 3 different classes. So for Seagate, it's Iron Wolf is the lowest class of NAS drive. Then you go on to Iron Wolf Pro, and then you go on to Seagate Exos. Western Digital has WD Reds, WD Red Pros, and WD Golds. And so it's pretty much the exact same thing, though I do want to say a quick thing about Western Digital drives. So part of the reason why I've kind of stuck to my guns on not recommending Western Digital drives is because Western Digital did a few kind of shady things a couple of years ago, probably about a year ago now. They started shipping what's called SMR drives in NAS boxes. So the Western Digital Red drives, and actually a lot of them, even the larger versions, were SMR drives and they were not telling anybody. So SMR stands for Shingled Magnetic Recording. And so what that is it's a more efficient storage technology that allows you to basically store more data on a platter by reducing the size of the write head to be smaller than that of the read head. Long story, you can look up graphics and it helps explain it a lot. Basically what an SMR drive is it's a normal hard drive and it will perform like a normal hard drive. A CMR hard drive, that's the conventional magnetic recording. But sometimes if you've written a lot of data to it randomly, it runs out of space and has to rewrite large portions of the entire disk before it can write any more data. And so that is why SMR drives can seem totally fine, have totally normal performance in them, until, okay, I've got to rewrite major portions of the drive, and it can change the latency to taking minutes just to write small amounts of data to it, and kills performance. And once you multiply this by a RAID, so say you have 8 hard drives in there, anytime one of them is doing this, the entire RAID pool is slowed down to that entire speed. And so it's not a great technology to have if you're in a NAS. For an external hard drive like this, I don't care. That's totally fine. That is the perfect use case for SMR. It's a hard drive, well, hey, who cares? It's an external hard drive. You're probably just dumping data to it. But when you're having to write an operating system and run a RAID, SMR is just not something you want to mess with. And so Western Digital was actually quietly, not telling anybody, selling these hard drives as NAS drives, even though they should never have been associated with NAS. Specifically ZFS, it can actually cause complete crashes and year-long rebuild times if you have an SMR drive in your ZFS pool. And so that's something to completely avoid. Currently, the only SMR drives that Western Digital is selling as NAS drives are 6 terabytes and below for WD Reds. But they didn't tell anybody and they didn't admit it, and there was a lot of shady practicing going on there. And that's honestly why I tend not to recommend Western Digital. And that's kind of why I stay away from them. Western Digital and Seagate tend to have the exact same pricing for their hard drives, but Seagate hasn't done that. There was a thing where Seagate was selling their desktop hard drives, their cheap desktop hard drives with SMR. That's fine. But just do not put an SMR drive in a RAID. It's a huge issue, and that's why I really kind of stay away from that company. Now, that's not to say if you've had great experience with Western Digital, just make sure not to get those SMR drives and make sure to get CMR drives. All NASs should be running on CMR drives unless it's just like one drive and you really are just using it as like a Dropbox pretty much. Then it's not a big of a deal, but I would really recommend make sure you get the CMR drives because a lot of times you don't even save any money by buying the SMR drive. They just are dumping them on you without telling you. All right, and so now within those NAS drives, I'm just gonna talk about Seagate because it's a lot simpler, and as I mentioned, I don't really like Western Digital right now. So within Seagate, there are 3 different options you've got for NAS rated drives. There are the Iron Wolves, Iron Wolf Pros, and then there's the Seagate Exos. And so the Iron Wolves are honestly fine for pretty much any consumer application. Really, they don't have that much different. The Pros do tend to just have better warranties and also larger caches and a couple of things like that. But in reality, you probably won't notice the difference too much in them for just consumer. The one nice thing about the Pros is you do get better data recovery and stuff. And so it's nice to know with businesses where money is cheap, downtime is very expensive, to just upgrade to the Pros because it's honestly going to give you less of a headache likely. But for consumers, I really don't think many people will actually need Iron Wolf Pros. Just stick to the regular Iron Wolves, though the prices have been crazy fluctuating. Now onto the very weird thing about the Exos. So Exos are going to be a lot louder and draw more power than the Iron Wolf or Iron Wolf Pros, but are rated for much longer runtimes and are cheaper. So I have no idea why they're cheaper, but they are significantly cheaper a lot of time. So honestly, if you don't care about noise that much, I would really look at the Exos. Just when you are buying an Exos drive, you need to double check and make sure that you're buying a SATA Exos drive. There are 2 different types of hard drives. They're SAS and SATA. SATA is what is in pretty much every computer you've ever used likely, and SAS is what's in servers. So if you have a SAS hard drive, you can only plug it into a SAS computer. So all Synologies, except for the upper echelon of rack models, specifically the SAS models, are SATA hard drives. And so just make sure you buy a SATA drive because the Exos do come in both methods. But sometimes you can save like 30% getting a better rated hard drive if you go for an Exos rather than Iron Wolf. I don't know why that is, but my next build is definitely going to be Exos because I've got a room for it anyway. And so I will get much better performance out of that long term and save a ton of money. So another thing I would do is right now with COVID and cryptocurrencies and supply chains and everything, supply of hard drives is very, very, very random. So for all of this, I would recommend waiting it out, and honestly, don't be tied to a specific brand unless you need to be. Once you do buy one brand of hard drive, I would recommend staying in that brand for the duration. You don't want to mix hard drives in a RAID. Weird stuff can happen. It's just way better to only ever deal with one specific company whenever you can. But if you're just starting out, keep a look on different pricing, because they can be wildly different. And honestly, supply is just coming and going for random NASs. All right, and so now onto the Synology option. So as I said earlier, Synology makes its own hard drives now. Well, partners with Toshiba to make hard drives. And honestly, for businesses that I'm consulting with, I tend to recommend the Synology hard drives. It's one of those things where nobody's ever been fired for buying a Dell. So it's the exact same thing. Synology hard drives will give you the best compatibility with a Synology NAS. They do have some technology in there that optimizes the communication between the drives. And so if you've got a ton of concurrent users, you can get better performance. Even with that out of the way, they're priced pretty similarly, or at least they used to. COVID screwed up all the pricing, and so right now they might be more expensive than the Ironwolf Pros. And so if you're a larger business, I still would recommend the Synologies. But if you're a small, like 2 or 3 person business, it's probably not worth it. But if they're within your budget, I would actually recommend the Synologies. Because if you start upgrading your NAS, there are the larger NAS models are now requiring use for Synology hard drives. And I don't want this video to be about the politics on whether or not that's okay. Basically, my opinion on it is pretty simple. For the enterprise units, I'm talking the XS Plus or any of the bigger rack-mounted ones, that's fine. I totally get having Synology requiring those hard drives, because honestly, businesses have a lot more money to give and also cost a lot more money in R&D for how many units are sold. So I'm totally fine with Synology doing that on their upper echelon units. Honestly, the hard drives are priced incredibly reasonably. Anybody who compares it to what Dell does, Dell will charge you 3 times as much for a hard drive if you buy it from them. Synology charges maybe an extra $50. So it's really worth it, and you do just guarantee compatibility. Synology's stance is they want to guarantee that Synology hard drives will be compatible with any Synology, and no business will ever run into a case where they purchase a hard drive even though it was approved on their list and it doesn't work. So I have had a legitimate time where I had a client who purchased a NAS drive. I think it was actually a Seagate, but don't quote me on that. I don't quite remember. He purchased a NAS drive that was on the Synology compatibility list. However, the drive he purchased had a firmware update that Synology had not tested yet. That NAS drive then caused a ton of issues with him and the NAS he had purchased. Even though the drive was on the list, the firmware upgrade ended up having some issue. I don't quite understand how that works personally. It's SATA. It should just be a simple communication. But for whatever reason, it caused an issue there, and legitimately he had to send back the units and get different hard drives. And so for a business, that's actually really bad. And so I do get where Synology comes from when they say, we want to ensure that there is an option to guarantee compatibility, because you know Synology is not going to push out a firmware that breaks Synology drives. At least you hope not. That's my quick stance on it. But for businesses who do think they are going to be upgrading to rack units and larger ones, buy the Synologies now. They are not going to cause you issues. I've worked with them before, and it's honestly just going to be easier down the line because Synology is requiring this. That's just a fact of it. With large units, Synology is currently requiring those. There have also been great drives, and honestly, I've never had any issues with them. The one downside of them is honestly supply chain stuff. So one thing that is unfortunate is when you're requiring a specific hard drive and supply chain stuff hits as hard as it has recently, there have been cases where I've not been able to find anywhere on the internet selling Synology hard drives. And so that's another reason why businesses always buy a spare hard drive and stick it on top of the NAS, because you never know what supply chain stuff's going to happen the exact time your RAID goes into degraded mode, and now you just can't buy a hard drive. It's one of those things, you definitely want to invest in that. So yeah, those are really all the different options you've got. And so it really comes down to how much you're willing to pay and how stable your data needs to be and how stable your NAS needs to be. The last little bit of an option is you've kind of got two different options. You have to have 5600 speed RPM drives or 7200 RPM drives. 7200 RPM drives for NASs are going to be a little bit louder, draw a little bit more power, but are going to be faster, especially in random reads. So if you don't have an SSD cache, you're going to notice a difference between the 72 and the 5600 RPM drives. Though if you're just a home user and you're dumping data to it over 1 gig connection, just buy the 5600 if it's any cheaper. It's really not going to be a big deal at all to most users. It's just when you're going 10 gig above and having multiple clients hitting it that you would notice those speed differences. All right, well, that's going to be it for this overview. Go ahead and leave any of the tutorials you'd like to see me make in the comments below, and have a good one. Bye.